Welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. For people who aren't familiar with you and all the amazing stuff you're doing out there with Youngstown State, remind me, it's bowling and basketball that you work with that way. Would you mind filling in a little bit about who you are and all the great stuff you got going on?
So I'm Nick Calhoun. I've been here for 6 years. Essentially, this will be my seventh season with basketball. Yes, I do have basketball and bowling, which are super fun sports to work with. Quite the contrast. But kind of got in the profession at the Division II level, interned with every sport. At a school called Fairmont State in West Virginia. I was a walk-on basketball player, not very good, but I really enjoyed training. I loved seeing the process. Felt like this is a niche for me. I've been around basketball coaches my whole life, but I thought the development and the performance aspect was more engaging for me, and I felt like my personality probably fits more from a training standpoint.
Absolutely. So it sounds like you've got a little background within the sport itself, and then obviously kind of call or niche focus on the performance and training side, if you will. And one of the things that jumped out to me when I was up at Youngstown talking with you and kind of getting up to, speed on everything y'all are doing is one, you guys utilize what you have exceptionally well, whether that's just space or the equipment you have that way. You guys seem to be masters of making it work with whatever you have that way and finding ways to solve problems, creative ways to solve problems, I'll say. And I think one of the outcomes of that is the fact that your team seems to be very resilient or robust, is the term that I like to throw at it that way. I haven't really heard of many cases of guys over 7 foot getting through an entire season without injury before. It seems to be pretty rare. It seems to be one of those things that in the basketball performance space, we just kind of accept, well, he's 7'5". He's probably not going to play every game because his height is going to work against him or whatever that way. But obviously, you guys have found ways to do it and do it very well over and over again. I'm curious just to get your initial thoughts on kind of the framework that you run on the S&C side with the guys up there at Youngstown State. What do you kind of do from an out of season and in season kind of programming approach with them?
Our summer block, we'll get them in the summer. Some schools go 7 weeks straight. We break it up. We go 2 3 week blocks with 2 weeks in between. So ultimately, obviously, your first week or two is acclimatization, but we do try to accumulate a lot of volume within those couple weeks, even if it's sub-maximal work. And a lot of that could be as simple as using, with your older guys, velocity-based training to regulate fatigue and numbers. And, you hit to a certain point, whether it's 0.6 to 0.8. And then with our younger guys or maybe our under-trained guys, we'll do more of maybe an eccentric isometric block, do a lot of tempo work with those guys just to try to build range of motion. And also too, just like get them used to moving something outside of their body weight, right? Like basketball players a lot of times are genetically gifted. They're actually pretty strong, but like when they go in the weight room, you're like, wow, this is crazy. Like this guy's can barely do push-ups, right? So just putting them in those positions, having a slow cooked approach where what's a win for this week? What's a win for this, given day? You hit on Gabe a little bit ago, our 7'5" kid that just went to USC. It's amazing kid. Like looking at specific cases and understanding like, what's going to get him on the court. And a lot of that too is, I think, is working with your athletic training people and having that relationship and understanding like what they're seeing. I'll be honest, I've gotten a lot better at it over the years. Initially, early in my career, I didn't really know how to have that relationship. So I think building that over time has made me better and also helped our program. And then we also have technology for major. We have Connexon, we have the True, we have the Vault system with both the Force Frame, which I want to use a little more here in the next couple months, and then also the Force Deck, which we use pretty frequently. So that gives us a good amount of baseline numbers.
So it sounds like in the out of season kind of blocks that way. You do 2 3 weeks instead of one continuous 7 week time frame, which is certainly unique in my opinion. But I think it sounds like it works for you guys. It sounds like you've got a lot of tech incorporated in that, but it sounds like in general, this is kind of like your GPP phase in the sense that we're going to lay the foundation for everything else. And one of the things that you mentioned is like, hey, especially our younger guys, like we push them from a range of motion standpoint, a tempo and control standpoint. And I think that that's something that isn't necessarily like, the first thought when people think basketball. I think a lot of times, especially with Instagram nowadays, they go on and they see basketball players who are, quarter rep squatting and different things that way. And, to their point, the guy's like 7 foot tall. Like if I'm 7 foot tall, I'm probably not going to go hips to heels. But regardless, I've seen numerous times, whether that be through guys like you or Pat Lewis or any of these amazing individuals in the basketball space that way, that it's like, hey, look, it's possible for your tall guys to move and move really well and get into some deep ranges. I think the other piece of that too is like, there's force output into the ground that you would measure with like a force plate, right? When someone pushes into the ground, but there's also muscle forces. And I think a lot of the times people think the two are synonymous and they're not. And it's like, I can get a really good muscle force output by training it through a full range, even if it's at a lighter weight. So for me, I'd rather get the benefits of training the guys through a full range as opposed to limiting the range to just this small kind of window that way. Because I think unless you're training it, you're not going to get adaptation at the end of the day. And it sounds like you guys start by laying a really well thought out foundation of the strength through the full range, or as full of a range as you can get for them, for to kind of like set them up for success when the season rolls around, I guess I'm trying to say.
No doubt. And I think the big thing too is be willing to have like variety within your training, right? So I only have 15 guys. I only have one other sport. My life is pretty much focused on strictly basketball. I will admit that, in terms of exposure and where my time's spent. But the big thing too is like I'm not married to certain exercises. So like I'll elevate the heels. I'll use specialty bars. We'll use dumbbells. We have kettlebells. I think just having those things in the toolbox can also like help you out a lot more, even from like a joint friendly aspect, but also too like driving intent. And you might get a kid for 6 months, and what's the quickest way to get the adaptation? A lot of times I think of it that way too. Like what's going to drive intent? What's going to, be more friendly as far as, the athlete's feeling, in which we do collect subjective measures and do questionnaires, which I do think it helps, especially with like your older athletes.
Absolutely. No, I do think that helps as well. And to your point on variability that way, how often do you change things up from an exercise selection and programming standpoint? Is that an every week thing, every 3 weeks, or what does that kind of process of changing look like for you?
So with our accessory movements, I'll switch them up in our second 3 week block this summer. For example, I'll do a little different exercise selection. Like right now with our younger guys, for example, we're honestly just trying to get really good at push-ups for one day, right? Because they're young and they're undeveloped and they could use the extra volume from that. In July, we'll progress to more dumbbell work. But for the most part, we keep our big lifts the same, to be honest. That way, too, there's not too much of a learning curve when we get into the fall and there's school and there's all these other stressors and once again, just trying to drive intent. But that being said, like if we have an athlete that I would consider like under special cases, like your 7 footers, like if my AT is telling me something to do that might be beneficial and I agree with it also. And we are willing to make that change, right? Like we even belt squatted in season with our 7 footers this past year, which I thought was good because one, the athlete liked doing it. Two, we were able to progressively overload it through over time. Um, Three, we were checking the box of, is this going to put him in a bad position, which it didn't, so I think that having that open-mindedness can carry a lot of weight.
I completely agree to that. I mean, I like to say that when it comes to exercise selection, you have to be agnostic. You can't just be committed to one thing here. You have to be willing to try and experiment with a lot of different things. And obviously, it sounds like the belt squat was a huge success and win for you all that way. Are there any other accessory variations or even main lift variations that you've incorporated that you just feel like were like home run shots for the basketball athletes that you work with? Anything that was like really well received and would definitely, program again, if you will?
So I do love specialty bars. I do love Hatfield squatting. I think it's great in terms of just putting our lower back in a good position. We can progressively overload that. We can vary the tempo. You can do a lot of things with that, and we'll even elevate the heels. That way we're for sure getting in those deeper ranges of motion. I know it's probably like a dumbified way of squatting, but I will say 70% of my team is seniors every year now with the way things are where, you have a kid for 6 to 8 months, maybe 2 years. What can you do to, get the adaptation? I've been experimenting with trap bar clean pulls too. I think those are pretty cool. When I first became a strength coach, I loved Olympic lifts. But I will admit, with some of the different body types I've gotten from going to a higher level, I feel like I've regressed from doing as much, to be honest, as far as like cleans. But we've been messing with that a little bit, trap bar clean pull. But I do think chin ups are really good, more shoulder friendly. We get really good at chin ups. I don't have a lat pull down machine, so we'll try to do weighted chin ups. We'll do ISO, we'll do oxidative, we'll do eccentric work. Just being really strong relatively.
Absolutely. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's like at the end of the day, if you use what you have and you increase strength through a full range of motion, it doesn't necessarily matter how you accomplish that, whether that's using a specialty bar or not, whether that's doing chin-ups or lat pull downs, whatever it is, if you get them stronger through a full range, good things are going to come from that. And I think the other piece too is like, just because they're basketball guys doesn't mean that they skip upper body days. I think a lot of times people look at the sport and they're like, oh, well, it's basketball. It's mostly lower bodies who just lift core and legs. And it's like, no, don't forget about the upper half of the body because in one way or another, everything is kind of connected. There was an athlete I was consulting with just about a month ago. An individual hit me up about this case. And essentially, what was explained to me is the mechanism of injury for their knee, their ACL tear, was that their shoulder dipped weird. And when their shoulder moved in this weird way, their like entire body followed. And that included the knee, which kind of led to a like non-contact ACL injury that way, which is crazy to think about. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, this is an individual who didn't do regular, consistent upper body training. Clearly, there was a weak link in the system. Did that weak link have anything to do with it? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. No one's ever going to know, and that's myself included in that. But it's just interesting to hear stories like that pop up where it's like, hey, it's really important for us to be strong everywhere, not just at the knee, not just in the legs. Everything needs to be really resilient. And obviously, as we've discussed so far, it starts with laying the foundation out of season. How do you transition that into the in-season work when the guys come in and come back to the university that way? What changes for you, if anything?
I think the biggest thing, and I've learned this over the years, is what they're going to do that fall on the court, essentially. So every program that I've been a part of, we always kind of do something different. Some years we're not doing as much on the court optionally. We're not doing as much even in practice. Maybe it's more teaching, so I can, really push numbers a little more within the fall. Then this past year, for example, we had endless gym rats. I think that was a huge reason why we were good in the weight room, I thought, and we overachieved throughout the year, I felt like. But I think the biggest thing is just figuring out that and then deciding what would be the best volume and what are you going to do to drive, intent. And I think also too, like now I'm starting to use the force X a little more where, who can we determine as more force dominant, who has, more of an asymmetry? How can we build off from that also now going into the fall? But basketball is unique because once you get in the fall, you're just going 100 miles an hour and then it turns to 4 hours to 20 hours. So, throughout that time, a lot of it is just work capacity because you're trying to prepare them for the season.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it sounds like you're using the force decks to kind of inform a little bit more of your decision making as it relates to kind of the performance program design. Is that, or are you doing more of like a profiling with your athletes or?
So I will admit we've only been here for 3 weeks, but I've done 4 tests, 4 counter movement jump tests, 4 squat jump tests. I'm leaning towards a eccentric utilization ratio method where we can kind of get some baseline numbers from that. I feel like that's more actionable for the guys that I have, just because you have some guys you can see, you probably assume they probably are force dominant, but the force deck may tell something different, or a lot of times it just confirms what we already know. So finding where to put certain guys in certain buckets is huge with me in that aspect. I don't have huge groups where it's a time killer and I gotta try to, keep everyone the same. Essentially, I got groups of 5 to 8 where we can get a lot of work done in a short amount of time, and we can really individualize, especially when you have older guys. I do believe that does play a factor, especially throughout the year now, because the sport really never ends.
Absolutely. No, it doesn't end. It's never ending, as you mentioned that way. And I think that point on individualization is key as well, because there's a certain time when you can kind of give everyone on the team, certain general things and they get better, right? I like to say the GPP drives about 80% of the results. but that kind of individualization gets you that other 10 to 20%. And I think that remaining 10 to 20% is what can set someone apart from like injured in season to healthy throughout the season that way. Because each individual, especially in a sport like basketball, is so uniquely built, right? It's a sport where you could have someone who's 7'5" and 5'8" on the same team playing the same sport. It's just wild to think about because it's like, wow, their bodies are built drastically differently. They move drastically differently as a result, femur length and so on that way. So naturally, I might have to program for them a little differently. And if I'm willing to make those compromises and adjustments, obviously the reward is, hey, we don't get nearly as many injuries or significantly less injuries than we would otherwise, I feel.
No, and I agree with that. I think the big thing too is like even like the guys that are tall, but then the ones that are still growing. Like that's something I've learned too with basketball. Essentially, like we have a kid that, well, there's a guy in college I played with that grew like 4 inches within a year, which was crazy. But we have a kid that's grown 8 inches in 2 years, and his growth plates are still wide open. So he could be 7 foot. Watching the way he moves right now, he probably is still growing. So like just finding ways to work with the AT is huge in those circumstances because I'll admit, like, there's days where I'm like, you know what, let's just load him, let's do this and that. And I think ultimately, you look at a guy's timeline, is it really worth it? And what's going to keep him on the court or what's going to help him get to the court. And a lot of times that could be as simple as just goblet squatting, and I think a lot of times, like, we always want to progress and I'll admit I've probably fell in that trap before too. But once again, just like the timeline and the individualization aspect's huge. I think the big thing working in a team setting, I think now is to reinforce what we're trying to do here is having some sort of team building exercise at the end where it's a finisher. And a lot of times that will be like something tempoed just for tendon health, maybe just try to get in those deep positions, or maybe we'll do like an arm day where everyone just finishes with arms and it could be something as simple as like time sets.
Yeah, if you want to increase your buy-in with your athletes, end every session with arm farm. It works. I can't quite explain the science. It's just highly effective. I love that. And to your point on kind of the athletes that are, skeletally immature at this point, a lot of times, I think when you're working with college athletes that are 20, 21 years old, sometimes even older in some cases, 23, 24, a lot of times people think, well, their growth plates are closed. We don't have to concern about any of those things. When in reality, there are cases just like you outlined where the kids are still growing and you have open growth plates, and that drastically changes things, especially if they do get hurt. So naturally, the conversation becomes we need to prevent this and do anything and everything we can to make sure they don't end up on the injured list. I think a lot of times there's cases that pop up where it's like, hey, we can still play them when they're complaining about soft tissue or some things are flaring up, but they can push through it. And it's like, one case that I personally feel it's not worth the squeeze is when you have the skeletal immature part of that conversation. It's like, hey, look, if they have an ACL injury and they have open growth plates, we have to concern ourselves with growth plate injury from that ACL, which will lead us to a leg length discrepancy. We also have to concern ourselves with the fact that surgeon graft choice might be altered by the fact that they have open growth plates, and that might change the conversation from a surgical standpoint. So as much as we can, when those conversations pop up, or when those cases pop up, I think anything we can do to avoid injury, even that's like you said, even if it's checking the ego and saying, hey, look, we're going to goblet squat instead of, Hatfield squat today or whatever it is, just changing our methodology to ensure that that main thing of keeping them on the court and keeping them healthy is accomplished. And it sounds like you've done a lot of work with your AT staff to help accomplish that as well. I'm interested to hear more about your framework for that because I've heard this come up with a lot of different individuals where sometimes they have phenomenal relations between coaching staff and AT and S&C, and others tell me that triangle is just out of balance. And I feel like the more well-oiled that machine of rehab staff, strength and conditioning staff, and coaching staff is, the better the athletes do. So what has kind of led you to the success that you've experienced with those relations at Youngstown?
I think the big thing with as far as sports performance coaches, especially like if we're trying to progress or maybe get to the next job, like there can't be like a non-relationship with sports medicine. There has to be some form of communication, like no matter how much you dislike the person, which I don't dislike any of our ATs, but I will say, like, if you really want to be doing your best work, I do believe you have to have some form of communication, and It doesn't always have to be like perfect, but it could be something as simple as, hey, this kid's good to go today, or what are you seeing? And a lot of times you do notice trends, whether it's behavior, whether it's just how they move, whether it's, an athlete's coming in all the time for optional extra work. But with coaches too, especially, every program's different. You'll meet coaches that want to meet with the AT and strength coach every week, and they have this high performance model. My situation, I feel like, is a lot different than most people's. I've been here 6 years, and I've known a lot of our staff just because I'm regionally from Ohio. So like me coming up and communicating is pretty easy. I will say with like a new AT coming in, it can be kind of challenging just because in today's world, we're just so focused on basketball, basketball, basketball. And a lot of times, like the basketball coaches don't want to hear the specifics of like what's going on with a particular athlete. Like I had a kid that came in one day and said it was Achilles. And then and he told the coaches that. And then the AT tells me it's posterior tibialis. And I'm like, all right, well, I have to go up there and just kind of point to where the athlete's feeling some sort of pain. And I think just having like a way to help each other is huge, especially when there's communication. I think for experienced coaches at a given program, like the best thing they can do is help facilitate communication with ATs, because sometimes I think a lot of the times they can kind of be pigeonholed into saying a certain thing, or maybe they just aren't as great at explaining to, a group of basketball coaches. So I think us is we have to try to facilitate communication where it might be hard for ATs.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a phenomenal point. It's how do I go out of my way to add value to the entire athlete picture here? What can I be doing to kind of help uplift the experience for that athlete? And sometimes that's modifications in the weight room, and sometimes it's facilitating conversations with other stakeholders. It's as simple as that. It looks different for each athlete, it looks different at each university, and so on that way. And obviously, some universities have so many stakeholders now. You have the addition of individual skills guys and individual strength coach for some of these different athletes that way. And then you've got team PTs and so on. There's just so many different individuals that kind of find their way into this basketball picture that way. I think the more you go out of your way to facilitate conversation between all of them, the better off you're all going to be. So I love your point on that. And I think the more on the same page, for lack of a better way to put it, you all are, the more successful everyone becomes, because it's like, hey, look, you noticed this? Oh, I noticed that too. Hey, you're going to intervene on this. I'm going to intervene on this. We'll check that box. We're good to go. The more on the same page everyone is, the more effective everything becomes as a result. I think a lot of times, we start doing, that same approach, but we don't know what the other is working on, and we don't know how much they're doing, and we might overdose or underdose something as a result, right? Ultimately, everything we do exists in kind of like a therapeutic window or therapeutic range. If we can get between minimum and maximum effective dose collectively on everything, our boxes are checked. We're 2 thumbs up. We're good to go. We're off to the races from there, I think.
No, I agree. And like it's crazy. I was just thinking about this. Like the athletes pick up on things, right? So if there's a negative relationship between a sport coach and AT, a sport coach and a strength coach, if there's a negative relationship between the AT and the strength coach, athletes are very receptive and they notice things that we might not think they notice, right? So I think just having that transparency and just frequent communication helps get your buy-in, right? Like if an athlete tells me that, hey, my back's hurting today, and I look at an injury report and from the day before, earlier in the morning, he didn't even like go see the AT, then it's like, well, I can always say you need to go see her or him for those reasons. So I think like having that kind of communication can help support one another on top of just like, hey, I talked to so-and-so, I know this is going on. We're going to do isometrics today, which, I've honestly done that numerous times with guys over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great point that way. And we've talked a bit about out of season framework. We've talked a bit about in season framework. We've talked about some of the adjustments you make on the fly that way with guys. And obviously, we've talked about that AT incorporation. You've brought up the tech side a number of times that way. This is something that I hear a lot of different things from a lot of different people, where some are making a ton of decisions based on the tech, and others are kind of just relying a little bit more on the subjective element, right? You mentioned questionnaires and that sort of thing. And there's been a number of people that put more stock in the questionnaires than some of the objective data from like force plates and different things that way. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on kind of how did you go about building a framework that allows you to kind of bring in the best of both worlds, if you will? How do you kind of combine that subjective report element with the objective element, and how do you kind of get your athletes to ensure they're taking that subjective questionnaire seriously? Because I've had some people tell me they feel like their athletes just kind of like throw down tens on everything every single time, regardless of if they played for 10 minutes or an hour. So how did you kind of go about developing those systems on your end that way?
So that's a great question. I'm not smart enough to do it, but I love data analytics. I love, just seeing data and being able to find trends. I think it helps in terms of sport coach communication. So like if you have charts and you show that you're measuring things and on top of progress, one thing I've learned over the years, coaches like to see progress. So our subjective measures, yeah, I've dealt with that numerous times where it's like, hey, please fill it out. And then it's like, well, fill it out honestly, So you have like some guys that are hesitant when they come in, they avoid the iPad or whatever. And I'm like, just fill it out, and even something as simple as like a body weight, right? Like we track body weights every day. The one thing I try to tell a couple of our guys, like, I'm not doing this to shame you. I'm not doing this to go back to the coaches and say this and that. It's more so just like looking at general health, So having numbers and just making sure that you're explaining to certain individuals like directly can go a long way, I feel like, with some of those measures. I do love the tech stuff we have because I feel like it helps kind of see where guys are at in comparison to one another. The Connexon stuff, right? I feel like I've fell in love with Connexon the past 2 years, which coaches sometimes think I'm probably too invested into it. But, if we're going to pay the money to have it, I want to maximize everything we can with it.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. It's one of those things when you have, the most trusted provider of basketball analytics. I mean, this is not a plug for Connexon by any means. I'm not working for them. I don't get paid from them. If you do work for Connexon, though, hit me up, please. It is one of those things that it's like when you have next level insights that expand beyond the scope of just kind of force plates or beyond just the scope of VBP. I think you can kind of bring them into everything else you do, right? Like I think of some of these different things like the NOAA system that some of these different teams are putting in, where now they can tell you like the shot and trajectory and the angle of like everything that these guys are doing on the court. And it's like, you're getting almost like too much data and too much numbers if you're just collecting numbers. But if you have specific questions you're trying to ask and problems to solve, those additional insights can actually become extremely valuable and helpful at the end of the day. So I think that as long as you have that framework built out, having all of those additional numbers and insights really kind of puts you ahead of a lot of the other groups that way and a lot of the other teams because you can see things that they can't see. And obviously, I don't think that fully replaces the coach's eye, but I think the two go together very well.
No, and it's funny how you can see kind of trends even in the past 3 weeks. I've noticed like several, right? So we have optional guys that come in, well, they work out option with coaches like right before the lift. And then they do their lift for an hour, which is a lot of work on top of it. And then they come in later in the day, but then the force deck numbers will tell me like, these numbers look really rough, right? Well, they're coming from the court and these coaches are having them work really hard, which the summer I do believe is meant for accumulation on the court, getting used to working with one another, working hard, especially in terms of building structure for each guy's day. The Connexon stuff I love to have just because I feel like having it a year and essentially collecting data, you kind of got like an understanding of like how practices ran. This is what stimulus I get from each drill. This is where, distance comes into play. You look at certain guys at certain intensities where, so-and-so's green, but then you compare him across the positional average. It's, well, maybe he's not, maybe he is working pretty hard, right? If coaches care about intensity, right? So I think that is huge. The biggest thing I probably noticed with Connexon the past 2 years is our first year we would practice pretty hard in terms of volume, like 2 days before the game. Like it was a pretty high volume. So this past year we kind of had a more linear approach where Mondays would be like our highest volume day. And that might just be, a lot of our non-contact shooting, walkthrough type stuff. But I'd rather have higher volume earlier in the week and kind of deload as you get closer to competition. That's kind of how we use it this past year. And I thought it helped keep a lot of our guys healthy.
Absolutely. No, I love that kind of framework that you built out that way. And it sounds like, thus far we've talked a lot about avoiding the injury and keeping healthy that way, but there's definitely certain cases that pop up that are just unavoidable, right? Like in my mind, I think about some of these different Achilles injuries that pop up in pro basketball. And
So many experts.
dude, everyone on Instagram is immediately like, "Oh, my program could have prevented that," and I'm very quick to call BS on that. I don't think some of these things can be prevented, even if you do have the perfect program. I mean, these guys in basketball, especially at these D1 and pro programs, they're amongst the best minds in S&C and physical therapy, AT rehab, and so on that way. And it's like, look, if they were all systems go on it, like I'm trusting their judgment, but if you do have someone get injured at Youngstown, what kind of injuries have you seen across your, 5, 6 years there in the sport of basketball? And what's kind of been your approach to try and help prevent those and mitigate those in the future, doing anything you can on the S&C side?
So it's unique. Biggest thing I've noticed, and I talked to our football guy about this, who does an amazing job with football. You see the highest numbers a lot of times across your kids that are transferring in. So from their previous schools, most of the time we'll have like your traditional ankle sprains here and there that do happen. Not as much as we've had in the past. Might just be because we have better luck, or just better athletes in general. We've had 2 ACL tears since I've been here, and I've been here. This will be my 7th year. So we've had 1 Liz Frank injury. There was 1 kid coming off COVID. He was 25 years old. He had an Achilles tear, which was wild because he played 100 games prior without an injury. And then the first game of the year, his 5th year, he tears his Achilles. And I'm like, this is crazy. But like you said, stuff happens. It's, you can't, PTs wouldn't be employed if we could prevent all this stuff, right? So we haven't had a ton of like shoulder or upper body work injuries necessarily. Broken hands here and there if a kid falls on it. I think we've had 2 of those in 7 years. Low back stress a lot of times just because they're 6'8" and above, a lot of them.
Yeah, no, definitely. But I mean, the numbers you just outlined are, in my opinion, and this is not the expert in the room talking here, but in my opinion, those sound at first glance lower than average to me. 2 Achilles, or 1 Achilles, 2 ACLs, 1 Liz Frank across that time. I mean, literally down here where I'm at in Maryland, clinically, I think I've seen 5 or 6 Liz Franks down here. And this is not just one sport specific, but I've been overwhelmed by the amount of them that I've seen in just about 2 and 2.5 year time frame that way. It's more than I thought I was going to see. Obviously, ACLs is always a hot topic. And, again, knock on wood, 2 across your time span there, in my opinion, is not that much that way. And I'm assuming the reason those numbers are low, in my opinion, goes back to everything we've talked about before, right? All the things that you've done really, really well. And obviously integrating that with the other individuals, right? Because unfortunately, and I made the mistake of this myself, I used to think it's all on one person to carry the boats, when in reality, it's not just one person, it's everyone coming together, kind of like we talked about before in relation to you going out of your way to communicate and get connected with your AT staff and making sure you two are on the same page. The same is true with the coaching staff, right? You could have the perfect load managed system in place from an S&C standpoint, and then your coach could just blow the whole thing up and make the whole team run gassers for like 3 days straight, right? Like there's things that can happen that, if you're not connected and on the same page, will lead to some of these catastrophic injuries from the data that we have. So I think the work that you've done leading up to this has certainly been instrumental. Is there anything else that you feel like really has helped to keep that injury rate so low?
So, every year we have 1 or 2 that are just kind of weird ones. Like I said, like those are just ones that like I don't know where, we went wrong on a lot of them, to be honest. I think the big thing, honestly, is we have coaches that are very receptive. They're not old school guys where I've worked with 2 coaches here and they've done an amazing job of periodizing practice. Some days I'm honestly like, we need to go a little harder, or we need to go a little longer. Really the only errors we ever have a lot of times is when we go from 4 hours to 20 hours a week, or maybe we, overdo it in those first week or 2. But for the most part, I've worked with pretty receptive coaches who kind of know how to, play in practice, teach everything they need to teach. And I think that does play a factor, like having, court volume and having a periodized approach to practice helps because I can still load them in season, so this past year was probably my best, I feel like, in terms of guys pushing numbers later in the year, which, they didn't have to, but I felt like for the most part, like they felt pretty good. They were able to do it. And a lot of that was because they were conditioned to play the sport. They did a lot of optional work on their own. Practice wise, it was very, competition specific. We weren't just out there, addressing a lot of issues. So I thought for the most part, having coaches that do such a good job of periodizing practice has helped me a lot. And then having ATs that do care and are willing to build a relationship with an athlete has really helped, and we do recruit pretty athletic kids. I will say for the most part.
Absolutely. And I want to hear more real quick about that kind of practice planning, if you will, because this continues to come up when I talk with strength coaches, so much so that some of them have built out Excel dashboards with their GPS data to specifically kind of plan the practices that they're involved in, obviously with the coaching staff that way. Interested to hear kind of more your thoughts around the concept of practice planning, where you feel SNC fits into that kind of envelope, if you will, but also how coaches can also maybe, go about planning or structuring their practices in a way that might carry over towards better health and success of their athletes. And when I say that, my mind initially goes to the high school coaches or some of the other coaches that, some of them are phenomenal and flawless by all means, but then some of them are also kind of like just figuring it out in the parking lot 10 minutes before practice sometimes. And it's like, I literally having a plan going into those things is far better than figuring it out on a whiteboard 5 minutes before the first whistle.
So it's really cool, and this is why I think connection is probably non-negotiable. I feel like for high level athletes, college basketball players, but I don't think you necessarily have to have it to be effective. A lot of times you can still collect time. You could look at distance on a court, for example. But the way we kind of do it is, I have a drill database essentially of everything we do. The first year coach, I had about 120 different drills, which is crazy. The first year we had, then this past year, I think we had about 87. So it's a lot different, but I break them down into half court, full court. One thing I've learned with our drill collection is our non-contact shooting drills, because you're constantly moving, are the most highest intensity. So I'll pull average load, average intensity. We use that in our return to play process, which I think has helped a lot of kids that we've had here. Coming back from injury, just having objective data to support what we're doing. So like if we're trying to hit a 300 load or AAL, for example, we would multiply time, AAL per minute times the time that you're doing it. And that's, our average load. Now it might be variable in some ways, but at least we have some sort of data to kind of guide of what a kid can sit out on, a kid can, do, a kid can avoid doing. I think that stuff has really helped us. And I'll just tell a quick story with Emily. We had a kid that came off of a Liz Frank and then an ACL tear. So he had back-to-back injuries, and
Oh my goodness.
I'm very proud of him. And Emily honestly did a phenomenal job with him. And like, I feel like without her help, that I don't know if I could have did it, or helped, progress him as well as, she did, obviously. But having a kid like that, for example, when you're trying to get him to play a sport he hadn't played in 2 years, what numbers can you go off of and how is he feeling from it? And one thing we learned is having a progressive overload, just like lifting weights, week to week, day to day, we were able to get him back into playing. And he honestly had some really good games this year for us where he got double figures. And just having those resources and actually using them rather than just collecting can go a long way. And having a database has really helped us. And the coaches will ask me, what does this look like today? Well, I'll go back to my database and I was like, well, this looks like an average of 600 load across the team, and obviously it's different for each player, but having those numbers, I do think helps progress us throughout the year.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think it takes time to build that up, right? That's not something you have on day one when you walk in. I think a lot of people want it on day one, but it takes time to develop that. And I think the biggest lesson that I've learned that would help individuals on that front is from day one, start building a framework to integrate all of those things. And I don't just mean like a one-page chat GPT generated plan. I mean, sit down and think about it real deep and start to like literally get pen and paper and just start to draw lines, make connections, build diagrams, whatever you've got to do as far as how everything intersects and engages with one another. Because the sooner you start to build that framework, the sooner you're going to start to see some of those connections that do exist between what you're doing, one, and two, an imperfect framework beats perfect randomization any day of the week for me. I've seen some people that just throw stuff at the wall and they get lucky and everything sticks, but they have no idea how or why. I've seen other people that throw stuff at the wall in a calculated method, very methodical based manner. And at first, maybe not everything sticks, but over time, they get more consistent, more consistent, and more consistent. And to be the person that figures out how to do it beats the one that just randomly gets lucky every day of the week.
No, I agree. And the biggest thing too, having this data is like you can't run away from what your true principles are, I think, in terms of just quality movement, managing adversity, and then just also too like understanding what's going to come about throughout the season. So I think that's one thing that's helped me is like building our conditioning plan and sense of volume of what we're going to see in games, what we're going to see in our preseason, what we're going to see in our first week of practice when we go from 4 hours to 20 hours. I mean, we can't just, guess, don't get me wrong, but we also too can't run away from the stressors that we do have. Like you still need to get strong, you still need to train hard if you can.
Absolutely. No, I could not agree more. To your point, you do have to train hard in season. You have to train consistently. And I think a lot of times people think, well, I'm in season, I don't have to train anymore. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, as we've talked, there's ways to modify it, right? Okay, back squat's not going well, belt squat, goblet squat. Just find a way to get the stimulus. Some stimulus always beats no stimulus. And I think as long as you continue to pound that metaphorical rock, you're eventually going to chip away at the whole thing.
No, I agree. A lot of it too is just, swallowing our pride, if we first got in the profession, when everyone squat 315 or, bench, 250 for, a basketball player, just having the understanding of what's going to be most applicable to, keeping a guy on the court and excelling within his role on a given team.
Absolutely could not agree more, Nick. I realize we could probably talk about this stuff all day long that way. I really appreciate the insights you've given and the openness you've got about sharing your framework and the work that you've been doing at Youngstown State that way, man. Is there anything we missed in our discussion today or anything else you want to throw out there?
I have 3 interns right now, which is a little different. I usually have like 1, and maybe there's something going on or they can't be there every day, but I've had 3 amazing interns. I think for coaches, it's great to try to help build the profession. I'm giving them tons of experience, which sometimes I feel like I'm helping them, don't get me wrong, but it's like you got to pass your CSCS, but nonetheless, they've helped me a lot in collecting this data and, taking a lot of stress off me where, it's one of me, 8 athletes, and I'm doing, 5 or 6 different things, but just having trusting interns that I can give, autonomy to is really helped. I almost view internship as like a mentorship a lot of times anymore, where it's more than just cleaning weight rooms and a lot of it's just giving them experience, but too like getting them in the weeds of, using technology and advancing their careers.
Absolutely, I could not agree more. And one of the things I've found as I've had students cycle in and out of the PT clinics and even a team of interns now under my own LLC that way, one of the things that I've personally found is like you have to be comfortable with giving up control and handing the reins to someone else, which is easier said than done because I don't know about you, but there's been a lot of times where I'm like, well, I don't feel like it'll be the same unless I'm the one doing it. Or like, I don't know how comfortable I feel handing this off to someone else, but at some point you have to do it and you have to trust them, right? Like the birds push the young ones out of the nest at some point to make sure they can fly on their own. And I'd assume there's something they look at before they do so to make sure those suckers can flap their damn wings. So the same thing is true here, right? It's like, you gotta eventually at some point relinquish some of the control and give them the chances that way. And that's certainly something I've struggled with at first, but I'm
Not
getting
easy.
more and more comfortable with. So, uh, Nick, for people who want to find out more about you and obviously everything you guys are doing at Youngstown State, and I'll give a shameless plug for obviously the internship and the programs that you guys do have out there for individuals looking to get into the S&C space that way. Where can they find you all at online?
We have our performance page on yscsports.com, which is accessible. I'm pretty much open book. If you want to email, I use social media. I'm kind of getting away from it. The more older I get, I think nowadays you just kind of stay away from your phone if you can, but I am responsive on Twitter, Instagram. If there's ever questions on, program philosophy, even internship opportunities, like I'd be more than willing to help.
That's awesome. Link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and see everything that Nick and the crew at Youngstown is up to. Nick, this was awesome, man. I really appreciate your time and the insights. Thanks for everything.
No problem, man. Thanks for having me.